Ladies and gentlemen, it is a curious thing how the ordinary becomes the sacred, and how the sacred can be forgotten in the ordinary. Take, for instance, the simple act of cleaning. We see it as mundane: scrubbing, sweeping, discarding clutter. But what if I told you that, in neglecting the spiritual weight of cleanliness, you may be leaving doors wide open not to the breeze, but to something darker? There are 7 mistakes common as dust, yet as dangerous as temptation. These are not mere oversights of hygiene, but subtle invitations, silent welcomes to forces you neither see nor believe you've summoned. In every home, there are places we rarely see: the forgotten corners, the backs of closets, the high shelves that collect more dust than attention. These hidden areas, while seemingly insignificant, possess a curious weight. They are the places where disorder hides in plain sight, the blind spots of our domestic lives. And yet, they may be far more spiritually significant than we imagine. Neglecting the corners of our homes is not merely a lapse in cleaning, but a metaphor for the parts of our lives we choose not to confront. The dust in the corner, the cobweb behind the curtain, these are not just signs of physical inattention. They symbolize spiritual stagnation, the slow and quiet accumulation of what is left unresolved, unspoken, or unseen. Just as darkness finds its foothold where light is absent, so too does disorder find strength in the places we ignore. In folklore and ancient traditions, corners have always held symbolic importance. They were often considered the dwelling places of spirits, good or ill depending on the state of the space. Old superstitions would have a sprinkle salt in the corners to ward off evil, or place a candle there to cast out the darkness. While we may not take such practice literally, they reveal an ancient intuition that what is hidden is not neutral. If left unchecked, it begins to shape the environment in ways we may not immediately perceive. A cluttered corner becomes more than an eyesore, it becomes a spiritual statement. It speaks of things avoided, decisions postponed, emotions suppressed. When we step around a mess day after day, we are practicing blindness. We train ourselves to accept the unacceptable, and in doing so, we surrender a small part of our authority over our own lives. The corner becomes a monument to everything we're too busy, tired, or afraid to face. And slowly that hidden chaos begins to echo in other areas of our lives, in our moods, our thoughts, our relationships. To clean a corner is to reclaim it. It is to say, I see you. I will not let you fester. There is an almost priestly dignity in this act, taking what has been forgotten and restoring it to order. Light returns, air flows, what once was still and heavy begins to feel alive again. This is more than cleanliness, it is spiritual renewal, enacted through the physical. Neglect invites entropy. Where there is no intention, other forces step in. They may not come with dramatic flair or supernatural displays, but their influence is felt in small, creeping ways: the heaviness of the atmosphere, the sudden irritability in a room, the persistent feeling that something is off. These are not coincidences, they are symptoms, and often they begin in the places we refuse to look. The next time you see a dusty corner or a neglected shelf, pause. Ask yourself not just what has gathered there in dirt, but what has gathered in. Clean it not as a core, but as a quiet act of resistance. For in doing so, you're not just fighting grime, you're fighting forgetfulness, and perhaps something darker. There is a strange weight to clutter, one that goes beyond the physical. A room filled with unnecessary objects, stacked papers, mismatched items, and forgotten things carries a kind of noise, a spiritual noise, a sikaido. It disrupts not only the aesthetic of a space, but the inner order of the soul. Physical clutter, while seemingly harmless, often breeds spiritual chaos. It muddles thought, drains energy, and weakens the clarity needed for discernment. Clutter whispers a lie that we are not in control, that life is too fast, too demanding, too messy to be brought into order. It convinces us to delay decisions, to accumulate instead of resolve, to store rather than release. But behind every pile of untouched items is a series of postponed choices, and each one weighs on the mind more than we admit. When our external world is crowded, our internal world begins to mirror it. We become accustomed to distraction, accustomed to disorder, until stillness feels foreign and quiet becomes unsettling. This state of cluttered living begins to erode our spiritual sharpness. Discernment, the quiet art of recognizing truth from falsehood, direction from distraction, requires space. It requires attention. It flourishes in an environment where the heart and mind are not overwhelmed by noise. But when clutter surrounds us, our senses dull. The chaos outside blurs our perception of the subtle promptings within. We begin to tolerate what we should have questioned, to entertain what we should have dismissed. In such a condition, spiritual insight gives way to confusion. Decisions become more difficult, not because they are more complex, but because our intuition is buried beneath layers of material and mental debris. We lose track of what matters, not from a lack of care but from the sheer volume of competing demands on our awareness. Clutter fragments our focus, and with it our spiritual integrity. Clutter becomes a silent idol. We do not worship it outright, but we bend to it in quiet ways. We make room for it in our homes while squeezing out peace. We allow it to shape our routines, our moods, and even our relationships. Conversations become tense, tempers short, patience thin, all because the environment no longer supports rest. Clutter creates an atmosphere of constant low-grade anxiety, and in such a state, the soul struggles to hear the still, small voice of wisdom. There is something profoundly freeing in clearing space, in removing what no longer serves a purpose. It is not merely tidying, it is reclaiming spiritual ground. Each act of letting go is a gesture of faith, a recognition that our peace does not reside in possessions but in purpose. As we remove clutter, we make room not only for beauty and order but for presence, for the sacred attentiveness that allows discernment to sharpen and the spirit to breathe again. It is through this deliberate clearing that clarity returns, and with it the strength to choose what is true. There is a stillness in a room that has not been opened to the outside. It is not the stillness of peace, but of something stifled, air that has lingered too long, thoughts that have remained unspoken, emotions bottled like stale breath in a sealed jar. The lack of fresh air in a space may seem a minor detail, a simple oversight, but it mirrors something deeper within the human soul. A room that refuses the wind is much like a heart that resists change. It becomes musty with fear, rigid with habit, and closed off to the living, moving truth that seeks entrance. Fresh air is more than oxygen, it is renewal. When windows are opened and breezes move through a home, there is a subtle shift in the spirit of the place. The energy changes. Old smells are carried away. The invisible particles of fatigue and tension seem to lift, and the space breathes. This is not just about physical ventilation, it is about the soul's willingness to be interrupted, refreshed and cleansed by forces outside itself. A home that is never open to the outside becomes insular, and that insulation begins to reflect in the hearts of those who live within it. To resist fresh air is to resist exposure. It is to say, in some unspoken way, I would rather stay in the familiar, even if it is stale, than face the unpredictability of change. But growth never happens in stagnation. Nothing flourishes in a sealed environment. Just as plants reach toward the light and bend with the breeze, the soul must also open itself to truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The breeze may disturb papers, ruffle curtains, or bring in a draft, but it also carries life. It carries movement. It carries clarity. A sealed room may feel safe, but that safety is a kind of deception. Over time, it becomes a refuge not from danger but from responsibility. It becomes a place where old ideas go unchallenged, where harmful patterns are allowed to settle into the walls like dust. Without fresh air, we convince ourselves that the way things are is the way they must remain. We stop asking questions. We stop listening. We stop changing. And so the act of opening a window becomes symbolic, almost sacramental. It is an act of invitation. It says, let what is real come in. Let what is outside my control enter and test the air of my certainty. It is a small, physical motion that aligns with a deep spiritual posture. The air that enters may be cold or warm, sweet or sharp, but it is honest. And honesty, even when it stings, is the beginning of transformation. In a world that rewards comfort and control, it is easy to forget the value of being unsettled by the fresh. But just as a room needs the wind to remain alive, so does the spirit. Fresh air does not merely clean a space, it declares that something in us is willing to be made new. There is something unsettling about broken things left lying around, a clock that no longer ticks, a cracked mug shoved to the back of the cupboard, a chair with a missing leg propped against the wall. These objects linger in our spaces not because they serve a purpose, but because we are reluctant to let them go. Sometimes it is sentiment, sometimes guilt, and sometimes simple inertia. But what remains overlooked is the quiet emotional weight these items carry. They are not just broken in form, they become vessels for broken memories, stored intentions, and unspoken sorrow. When purposeless or damaged items accumulate in a home, they often become mirrors of emotional residue left unresolved. We don't always notice it consciously, but we feel it. A broken lamp becomes more than a faulty appliance. It begins to represent a failure to fix, a sense of incompletion. An unused object, one that sits idle and untouched for months or years, becomes a whisper of waste, a reminder of plans that never took shape or dreams that faded. These objects become saturated with emotional associations, some obvious, some deeply buried. And over time, the home itself begins to feel heavy, not because of the physical presence of these items, but because of the invisible emotional clutter they generate. Energy, whether you consider it metaphorically or spiritually, tends to follow attention. When we surround ourselves with things that are unresolved objects we no longer use, cannot fix, or cannot bear to discard, we create an environment of stagnation. These items subtly reinforce messages we would never say aloud, that we are stuck, that we are overwhelmed, that we are somehow incapable of moving on. Even if these messages are not consciously believed, they settle into the background of our days, shaping our moods, thoughts, and behaviors in ways we might not even recognize. Broken or purposeless things often carry the past into the present in unhealthy ways. They may be tied to painful moments, failed relationships, or versions of ourselves we are trying to outgrow. Keeping them may feel like honoring memory, but in truth, they can serve as anchors to sorrow. When we keep what is no longer alive in our lives, we slow the process of healing. We prevent space from opening up for the new, the whole, the purposeful. There is wisdom in the ancient rituals of release, burning what no longer serves, burying the broken, giving away the unused. These practices aren't about rejection, they are about acknowledgement. They say, this has had its time, its season, its meaning. But now, it is time to let it go. The space it occupied can become something else, something lighter, freer, more aligned with who we are becoming. In clearing out the broken and the purposeless, we're not just cleaning a home, we're clearing out echoes of emotional weight, making room for clarity, intention, and quiet peace to take root once more. Every space holds more than furniture and air, it holds atmosphere, energy, memory. The home is not just a shelter, it is a vessel. It contains the residue of our thoughts, the tone of our conversations, the quality of our silences. When we neglect the spiritual life of our home, we are not simply leaving things untouched, we are leaving them unguarded. This neglect is not neutral. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums are never left empty for long. Something always comes to fill the void, and what enters is rarely benign. Spiritual neglect begins quietly. It starts when prayer becomes infrequent, when sacred music is replaced with noise, when gratitude goes unsaid and peace is no longer cultivated intentionally. These are not dramatic changes, but they shift the tone of a space. The home becomes spiritually thin, lacking presence, lacking blessing. And into that thinness other forces begin to press in: tension, fear, restlessness, division. They do not come as intruders but as opportunists, slipping in through the cracks of our forgetfulness. Every home has its own spiritual climate, and like any climate, it must be tended. A garden left untended does not stay empty, it fills with weeds. The same is true of the spirit of a place. When we stop speaking life into our rooms, stop singing into the morning light, stop naming joy and beauty aloud, the atmosphere begins to dim. We may still clean the surfaces, light candles, and keep things visually pleasant, but without spiritual attention, the soul of the home begins to fade. And where soul fades, shadows grow bold. This is not superstition, it is pattern. Harmful forces do not require full permission, only neglect. They thrive where there is confusion, heaviness, and disconnection. A spiritually neglected space becomes fertile ground for spiritual dissonance, strange anxieties, persistent irritability, emotional fatigue without cause. People in such a home may begin to feel burdened without knowing why. Children become restless, sleep becomes troubled, peace becomes elusive. These are not coincidences. They are symptoms of a space left spiritually vacant. To tend the spiritual life of a home is not complex. It requires presence. It requires speaking truth aloud, offering blessing, keeping space for silence, creating room for joy. It means dedicating not just a corner but the entire dwelling to being a place of light, no matter how small or humble. It is not about grand rituals but about consistent intention. A whispered prayer while sweeping, a song of thanks while folding clothes, a deliberate moment of stillness in the evening light, these acts push back against the vacuum. They declare this place is not empty. It is filled with purpose, with love, with meaning. Neglect, on the other hand, invites what we do not intend. In forgetting to bless, we permit something else to settle. And over time, what is permitted grows strong. This is why spiritual attentiveness matters not as an ornament to our lives, but as a shield. The soul of the home, like the soul of a person, thrives where it is fed, and where it is not, something else begins to eat. There is more power in the posture of the heart than in the movement of the hands. When it comes to cleaning something so often treated as drudgery or duty, the attitude we bring to the task carries more weight than we realize. A home does not only absorb the fragrance of soaps and sprays, it absorbs the spirit with which we move through it. Every action, even the smallest, leaves a trace behind. Cleaning in anger, resentment, or bitterness does more than make a task unpleasant, it sows that emotion into the very atmosphere of the space. And over time, the house itself begins to carry that tone. Cleaning, at its best, is a form of care. It is the daily, often quiet, expression of love for a space and for the people who dwell within it. When done with intention, with gratitude, humility, even joy, it becomes an offering. It transforms the ordinary into the sacred. The wiping of a countertop, the folding of a blanket, the sweeping of a floor becomes a liturgy of peace. The spirit of calm we carry while cleaning is left behind in the air like a subtle perfume, changing the emotional texture of a room. But when we clean with frustration, muttering curses under our breath, or with a sense of resentment toward those who've left the mess, we are not simply moving dirt, we are spreading our mood. A room cleaned in anger may be spotless, but it will not feel light. The tension will remain. The home becomes polished on the outside but heavy within, as though something unresolved still lingers in the corners. The work may be done, but peace has not been planted. Children sense it. Guests feel it. Even we, though we may not name it, respond differently to rooms that have been tended with warmth than to those that have been scoured with resentment. The spirit within the homemaker flows into the space, whether they mean it to or not. This is why our inner state while cleaning matters so deeply. It is not only about order, but about atmosphere. We are not just setting things right physically, we are setting things right emotionally and spiritually. This doesn't mean we must always feel joyful while doing chores, but it means we must become aware of what we carry into the act. Choosing to clean with gentleness, with a prayer on the lips, or even just a calm breath in the chest, is a way of declaring, this space matters. These moments matter. I choose to bless, not to curse, and that choice lingers. It settles into the walls, into the fabric of the cushions, into the cadence of footsteps across the floor. Our homes are not simply shaped by what we do, but by how we do it. The attitude we carry, the thoughts we think, the words we say to ourselves while we work, they shape the unseen foundation of the dwelling. Clean hands may make a home tidy, but a clean heart makes it whole.